Morning, everybody. It is 11:30. We're going to get started. We have a few more people who are going to be jumping on. If we can flip to the agenda slide, please, Mary. So today we're going to start kind of grounding in where we are and thinking about what's happening in the world around us. The purpose of today's webinar is to unpack some new guidance that was released over the weekend and on Monday that was sent out on my listserv, the specially designed instruction toolkit. And we heard from a few people that they did not have access to that. And so if you are not on that listserv, please send us an email and we can get you on there. So if you're not getting all the updates and information and all the guidance that's coming out, as well as links to all the webinars are going through that. And so if you haven't yet connected through that listserv, please connect with us, send us an email, and we can get you on there. So we're going to unpack the SDI toolkit today, and then we're going to do some open sharing and problem solving. And you're going to hear from a few colleagues, and I might, depending on who's on the line here, ask others to think about it and to consider what are ways that we are problem solving through this, that we're leaning forward, and that we're leading in this great time that is challenging and difficult and hard on all parts of our system, especially those who experience disability and those that we serve. So we'll go to the next slide, Mary. So while this is on, I'd like you to take a minute and think about this quote. So if you've been a special ed director for a day or a month or a few decades, you have had to lead in a gap when nobody else is there. You have had to have a voice for the voiceless, and you have had to be the champion for the students and families who don't always have somebody there. This is no different, right? We're strong in what we know, strong in what we see, and strong in what we want. We have to act courageously, and we have to do this together. I also want to set the tone and share some information. This morning, we have a staff meeting with Colt and the executive team at ODE, and some information was shared that I thought was sobering in context of our work. So this pandemic has a varied effect on communities of color. I want to highlight this before we start to remind us that this is hard work. This is a national health emergency, and people are dying and living in devastating conditions. And I say this in the privilege of my home and space. And we live right now in the privilege to even consider compliance and to try and unpack and talk about the technical components of an IEP. And that should be matched with deep compassion and understanding of those that we're trying to serve. Among the hardest hit groups right now are our Latinx, Latino communities. We learned that our community leaders are calling out needs, demanding resources from the elected officials, that they're being the hardest hit and disproportionately. Our Black African American community has named a clear lack of people making decisions in response to COVID-19. People of color are not making those decisions. There are people that look like me in white skin. The deep impacts also today shared about our 9 federally recognized tribes. We were reminded today, and Colt shared, that disease is part of the genocide of Native Americans and now continues for tribes across this country. People are dying and there are tribes facing extinction. Burns, Paiute, and Warm Springs are in challenging and desperate situations. Businesses are shut down, and for many of these tribes, the primary economic resource of casinos has been closed. People are out of work and the government options are close to services are close to shutting down. There's no relief in the federal CARES money. There's no attention to tribes directly through that. It's up to each state to scramble to find resources. I encourage all of us in this work to ground ourselves and think about care and connection first. What I just described are challenges that are real, that our families are facing, and that we have the opportunity to sit and to lead and to hold that and to know that we can lead people forward through this. And so I want to set that tone and make sure that as we dig into the technical components of SDI, that we remind ourselves that we're in this work because we serve students and they are people first, and they are part of families and communities that are hurting and suffering. And we have to, at the forefront, the first, always think about relationships and connections. Next slide, please. In the specially designed toolkit, you'll find a page, the first one, you can use with your case managers and school teams. This nice infographic provided by Dr. Wells for us was an overview of the toolkit and the steps. On the left side, there's 4 steps for you to take. So if you don't want to digest all of the toolkit at once, start with that. Think through, what can we do first? First, review the guidelines for special education that was released a few weeks ago. If the IEP can be implemented as written, there's nothing you need to do except lean in and start teaching and planning. If SDI needs to be adjusted, consider a template that I'm going to share with you and show you to use to support your case managers and special ed teams going forward. And always, if parents disagree with proposed changes, you should be scheduling IEP meetings to talk about the context and the space and what their needs are right now. The full instructional day is also listed in here because that's an important context, that it includes 3 buckets of learning, and that the teacher-led time is not the only time that SDI should be occurring. Just like in our schoolhouses and our school days, SDI doesn't happen just with one-on-one direct instruction. And there's some questions for teams to consider when planning SDI. Can the students' goals be met in this context? What are the LRE options as we consider this? Can SDI be taught by both Gen Ed and SPED right now? What does that look like for these students? And then how can you leverage the assets of our students and families? Next slide, please. The toolkit is broken into 4 sections. The first section is framing values and understanding distance learning for all. We acknowledge that there is a problem in the way that education was designed and created for those to serve and those it was not designed to serve. Special ed teams have for decades been working to overcome the systematic oppression that happens for students who experience disability. During distance learning for all, it is critical that teams think about that, evaluate that, and hold that at the heart of their decision making. Because when students are already in an oppressive system and they already experience disability, there is an amplified opportunity for extreme oppression and distancing to happen with our students. Students that we serve, they can and should succeed right now. And we've seen multiple opportunities where that has surfaced and come true when teams are leaning in with creativity, with heart and care, and working with the family assets. Next slide, please. The guidelines for distance learning are included in here, and these are mostly from general education with a couple notes. The equity and access, the UDL components, are part of the general education perspective. Colt shared yesterday with superintendents that this is a plan for everybody. This is how we should start, and that the 4 quadrants in the design for distance learning for all does not include everybody needs to be perfect in this. This is a starting place, and if your district is brand new and has never had these conversations, it's an opportunity to lean in and say, how will we do this and how can we plan? How can we support each other and how can we lead through this? Next slide, please. It also includes some notes to the teacher-led learning time, and that this includes the 3 buckets, the teacher-led time, supplemental activities, and nutrition. About SDI because they're all included when we think about students in our schoolhouse. That there is direct instruction, there's independent practice, there's group time, there's small group time, there's recess, there's lunch. We have SDI that happens all over the school day. And we need to be as creative and flexible when we think about SDI right now for us. Next slide, please. I would say also review, this has links to the special education guidance that was released a few weeks ago. And this is the information of the 6 points starting here. What do you do if you're stuck, if you don't even know where to start? Overview of distance learning for all. Review IEPs. This doesn't need to be an IEP meeting review. This is a case manager looking at the IEP and looking at the distance learning for all with colleagues and a team and seeing about implementation. And then to the maximum extent possible, implement the IEP as written. Right? School placement, we've said repeatedly, it can be considered, but this is not a change of placement. That districts and school teams did not unilaterally make this decision for a student. All students are experiencing this change. And then districts should examine the effect of school closure on a student progress towards their IEP goals, knowing that there are going to be some students that are impacted at greater variance than other students. Next slide, please. Also included in that guidance from a few weeks ago was this table. If during the extended school closure an IEP team determines they cannot meet the requirements of the IEP, they should be convening an IEP meeting either virtually or on the phone, into some written agreements or amend it, and then review new goals and services. And upcoming, what we're going to be working on is tracking. What can that look like to track services for either extended school year or what we're calling compensatory education, some type of summer bridge program or some kind of service that's extended in that. And there's going to be more coming through that. Next slide, please. The second section of the review of the IEP. So this is where you want to work with your case managers and your school teams to review the student's unique disability in relationship to the district's distance learning for all plan. And remember that for many of our students, this closure represents the first time that they're going to be included to the same extent as their peers without disabilities. That it presents incredible opportunity for us as school leaders to lean in and be creative and bold and to offer new and unique ways for our students to be educated alongside their peers because they have access to a gen ed teacher. They can be included in reading groups that are happening already with their classroom teachers. They can be included in multiple curriculum design lessons. And so I encourage teams to think about this as an opportunity and a new way to present information. Next slide, please. As part of the review of SDI, you need to look at the service type, which should be alignment with the goals in your review of those. The minutes should be based on the unique needs of the student. The location and providers shouldn't change in this context. Location, every student is going to be educated in the same location right now, regardless of what's written on the IEP. So the department is not recommending a change in those as necessary because every learner will have the same impact. And the same with providers. If you have LEA or ESD written, we're suggesting that you not change those unless you are changing providers from an LEA. Next slide. Some questions to consider for your school teams as you think about SDI. What were you in the process of teaching before schools closed? What activities did you have planned? What standards were you going to cover? And were there tools and techniques that you were using that you can send to the home? And task analysis, first then, choice boards, things that you can gather from the school, you can print, you can send to the families so that they can use those. It's important to emphasize also, I think, this quote from USDOE, that federal disability law allows for flexibility in determining how to meet the needs of students. It's intended to be individualized in how we work on compliance and how we try and make sure things are really set. Sometimes we lose sight of this. And so I want to bring this to the forefront. This was released this month as a reminder for school teams not to be rigid and to lean into flexibility, to lean into options, to think of creative, new, amazing ways to serve our students. Next slide, please. One of the components that a school team needs to look at is evaluating the minutes of SDI. And when you consider that under the context of distance learning for all, think about the maximum daily guidelines of all three buckets and not just the teacher-led time. Teacher-led learning will be bolstered by other activities just like it is during the school day. SDI was never limited or intended to be one-to-one teacher instruction. Therefore, it's not limited to just the teacher-led learning time during the closure. Next slide, please. We gave you an example in this toolkit of a first grade student who has considerable service minutes. And if you think about the need here, and this was an example provided for us by Central School District. And so I want to thank them for their willingness to lean in and support the districts as you are able to plan and think through options. Some things to note in here. During typical schoolhouse time, when we have students in our care, we would not use parents to do any provision of service for SDI. And I would say under this context and this guidance, the department is issuing this as guidance and coverage for districts. It is intentional, and we're saying that it can be in partnership with. Clearly, you have to negotiate with a family here and not just say, under the book, read aloud, so the first grader parent, you're going to go do this. It should be in concert with and talking to them. And if they're adverse to it and not willing to do it, I would say just, or if you're uncomfortable, shift it to virtual, right? And then it can be both the gen ed teacher working through the 30 minutes of the 45 minutes, and then your special ed team working on the 15 minutes. This can be para educators, this can be other employees you have through. It doesn't have to just be the case manager doing this. And so just like we do when school's in session, I would find multiple ways to engage in this section and provide opportunity. Also to note in here that we are, because this is guidance that the department is issuing, we are providing coverage to districts through this. And if there are state level complaints from parents on this particular issue, they wouldn't surface past our guidance. And so we would remind them that this was guidance issued by the Department of Oregon, the Department of Education in Oregon for districts. And so you have some coverage in that. Next slide, please. When you think about SDI, it's critical that you understand that this represents a different take on how districts could choose to implement it when students are in the schoolhouse. As noted earlier, there's no one right way to provide supports for students. This is an unprecedented time, and we're all trying and we're all learning. We strongly encourage innovation and iteration. First, focus on the relationships, the care for students and families. Next, connect with them where they are. And lastly, in the toolkit is compliance, and it's last on purpose because we want you to think about the other things first. Each student that we serve is going to experience this school closure differently. Our first job is to provide care and connection, and then focus on instruction. Next slide, please. The toolkit includes a number of options for your team to consider, and some great questions that we've adapted from Ohio and from other states. And this one is lots of great examples of transitional functional skills, how to help families and students maintain physical activity, how to be creative in this time, how to think about things like dancing and playing games and puppet shows and creative videos that your students can be creating for you, and how all of that can be captured in your SDI. And so there's a lot of opportunity we have right now to lean forward in that. Next slide, please. So the third section of the toolkit, this is really the compliance portions of it. And so if you are in a spot where you believe that your IEPs cannot be written as, or implemented as written, and you need to do one of a few things. You either can amend the IEP and adjust it. You can use what we're going to share with you as an emergency contingency plan, or you can hold an IEP meeting. So those are the options you have. The only new one is going to be the emergency contingency plan. The department is also going to be releasing further track and plan for the small percentages of students who may need additional support, and that the closure has a different impact on. If you're interested in participating in this panel, I would encourage you to capture Mary's email here and email her, and she will be able to link you to this, and we'll be working over the next week on generating this guidance document for districts to be able to, again, identify, track, and plan for the small group of students who were previously who couldn't have accessed general education options, who were in segregated classes, or those who right now whose goals and services can't be met under the Distance Learning for All plan. Next slide, please. So the first option you have, if you're in the situation where you need to amend and change an IEP, you can, like any time during the cycle of an IEP, adjust either the goals, specially designed instruction, services, placement, any of that. And during this extended closure, when you evaluate SDI and you determine there should be a change, that you can communicate with the parents, use a prior written notice, and use the written agreement process to change the IEP. We are not requiring any state level reporting system changes. And so if you're reporting directly in Synergy or TyNet or a student information system database, you do not have to change it in there as much as you need to document for the family and for your case manager what the changes are. Because what we're trying to avoid is we don't want people to change now to have to change again in the fall. So this may reflect changes updated during the closure, and the teams can individually decide if that's an appropriate course of action. Next slide. The second option teams have is to consider a new form that the department has issued. This is a very simple 4-page form. We've adapted it, and this is in coordination with several other state agencies that we are releasing this as part of an opportunity for districts. If you are struggling with considering we need to make a change, and it's a small change on this, but we don't want to amend the whole form to go back and amend again, or it's going to impact a number of our students, this is an option you may consider. This form is only to be used during the extended closure under the executive order, and it is in lieu of what we discussed before, a written agreement and prior written notice. Next slide, please. This form should be completed with a Distance Learning for All plan in mind. And for each section, it's recommended that the change is clearly represented for families. This document is intended to serve as a communication tool for school teams and parents. And so there's a very clear distinction about, here is the IEP that we had prior to closure. Here is this form that shows what are the changes and where does that live in concert with this. So you don't have to change the IEP now and then change again in the fall. This form is a placeholder only during the closure to share that. In the form, in all of the fields and boxes, you only need to indicate where there is change. For sections that will not change, the district could say no changes are necessary, or please see, or something similar, and see attached IEP. Next slide. The third option teams always have is to hold an IEP meeting, and this would be appropriate if a parent disagrees with amendments or the contingency plan. Or if it's a student who has complex needs that the team feels they need to come back together and say, given the context and closure and what we know, what can we implement and what do we need to adjust and change? And what are realistic goals? Or do we need to change our goals based off of this because the needs have changed for our students? During this time, we would encourage teams that are holding IEP meetings. Districts are reminded of the many options to hold meetings. Just like we did when students were in our schoolhouse, you can hold meetings over the phone or virtually. And also you can use all of the listed in the toolkit, the excusals for attendance not necessary options of IEP members. And so the critical partners are going to be, you want to include parents, you want that to be your first and foremost, and then your case managers, and moving through your options with general education and other providers through that. Next slide, please. The last section of the toolkit, I will say, it's exciting because there were some front runners in here, some people who were bold and vulnerable and shared their plans with us really early. And it can be a scary thing to be the first one out the gates. And so, we saw 2 districts that right away after they spent the weekend with us working with the department on guidance, on creating plans, on generating things. So the first one, Central School District with Christina and Julie, deep gratitude and appreciation for the work and the and attention to detail and the care through this. And the other plan we received that we posted in here is Beaverton, and the same thing, a lot of time with the school teams over the weekend, trying to create and generate ideas for people to see as new ways of how can this look. And so I would say, spend some time with your school team looking through those. There is also a sample IEP in this section and a walkthrough of steps of if we were going to do this, how would this look and what is the process that we would take to go through that IEP to adjust this. And so if your team doesn't know where to start, it's a good place. It's a resource again. It is not a must do. And so I would encourage you to use this section as a, what could this possibly look like and how does this play into our context? Next slide, please. Here's an example of the Beaverton plan. Again, Danielle and her team were great partners in sharing this with us and providing options for teams to think about what this could look like. And their model has been the I do, we do, you do stages of SDI. So thinking about how that can be incorporated into the 3 buckets. I will also share that their superintendent shared with superintendents yesterday across all of the superintendent group that it was a perfect opportunity and time to lean in and think about the students who experience disability being educated in Gen Ed first. And he really talked about the benefits that they were seeing and deep partnership and work on this. And I think for a number of superintendents, it was a good positive message for them to hear. Next slide, please. The other thing I will share is that the Beaverton plan has 2 distinct components I thought were really helpful on what is SDI and what is not SDI. And if you look through about the middle of what is SDI, so instruction provided by general education, paraeducator, or parent under the supervision or direction of special ed. So this isn't a context we would ever employ during our students in our schoolhouse again. But during this extended closure, this makes sense because parents are in deep partnership and sitting with us. It's not the same thing as parent-directed instruction and parent being the curator and creator of information and learning.
Candace, this is Shondine. Could you repeat that part? That was super important and you went out for just a moment.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to say, let's see if I can get all of that again. So I think an important distinction in this table is that the instruction provided by the general education teacher, paraeducator, or parent under the supervision and direction of special education can be considered SDI during this context. It is also a good shifted look on the right side and say that parent guardian direct instruction, where they would be the creator and the designer of instruction, is not what they're looking for SDI. And so if we thought about this context of parents being partners with us in this, under this emergency closure, this makes sense. And this is a practical starting place for school teams to be able to lean in and say, okay, how can I get into this and possibly get started? Thank you. Next slide, please. So during this time, I've asked a couple people to share some information and be willing to be vulnerable also and share some of this, how they're leaning and going forward. So first I would ask Christina Shepard, I see you are still on, if you would be willing to share with us, where are you at? What do you need right now? And how has it been? And what are the thoughts, or where are you guys moving forward? And what are you finding with your teachers at this point?
Yeah, so our district, our superintendent has been very intentional in the phrasing of go slow to go fast. And so we are in a place right now where we are still not postured to go with 100% virtual or even a hybrid. We still have some students who do not have access to technology and or Wi-Fi. And so those devices are being distributed and shared with families every single day, but we are in that place. And so as we began to do some problem solving around the SDI and what that would look like, and really trying to think about when you have a kindergartner and the teacher is supposed to do 45 minutes of teacher-led activities And then you look at their SDI and they have even more of that. So what would that look like? And so we have done trainings now. Julie Heilman has done trainings with all of the licensed case managers, and really just having them dig in and figure out, take the kids that they can easily transfer into this model of SDI. I will say our hardest place right now is secondary, so middle and high school. It's really, I believe this process has highlighted and shown some problematic, I don't want to say problematic, but equity issues that we know about, but when now we're trying to transfer into this model, it becomes glaringly obvious. And so so it is a great time to kind of lean into it and take this as an opportunity to look at our practices and kind of where we want to go once we do go back to traditional schoolhouse instruction, even though our instruction is probably going to be changed forever after this. And so that's kind of where we are. We're packet based at this point in our district for K-12. High school is already, they're moving towards more virtually based. And so our special ed staff are working in partnership with grade level teams in developing those packets and ensuring ensuring that their needs are being met. And so we're in the process right now of going through our IEPs, finding those kids that we can meet their needs, and then problem solving those that we're struggling with, bringing in a larger think tank to talk through that. And so that's kind of where we are. Is there anything else, Candace, you wanted me to cover?
No, that is so perfect. Thank you. And I think I appreciate very much that you highlighted that it's not all roses and right, perfect and beautiful, even though you guys have a great example, that there's real challenges that we're all trying to manage and work through. And so thank you for leading that and sharing. Michael, you were on, and you and I had a conversation last night, and I thought your focus and support was really critical. Are you willing to share that?
I'd be happy to. Thanks, Candace. We've come up with a new acronym in Malala that we're really excited about, and a bit of a new process. We're calling it because we need more acronyms in special education. It's called the ICDLP, and it's a process where our case managers, we want to give them some tools and some process so that they can move through and not have to think too much about like defending their practice, but really have that focus on equity and connection with families as the primary starting point. It's the ICDLP is called Individualized C19 Distance Learning Plan. And it essentially, we set it up, we're a Google district, so we set it up where we've got a Google form where it walks our case managers through the conversation and collaboration with parents. So that's the first step, is that they reach out and make those connections, checking in, how you doing? Thanks, Trish. Checking in, how are you doing? How are things going at home? What are some of the barriers that you're finding? Because at our elementary K-12, we've got some packet learning happening. There's some pockets. We've got a couple of distance learning platforms that we're using for our SDI. If y'all don't know, MobiMax is offering free platforms. If you call their sales office, they're waiving the fees, and you can get your folks on, and it's individualized, and that may work for a lot of your kids that have that SDI need in core academic areas. So we're problem solving around technology. We're prioritizing getting technology and connectivity out to families. I'm personally showing up to work 3 days a week, and I've got these windows. I've got my little table set up out in front of the district office, and I've got the drive-through set up where families are showing up, and I do the little check-in. They don't even have to get out of their car. And if they need a Chromebook, I check, what they need. And we've got T-Mobile hotspots that we're also checking out to families. We have a limited number, so we're really doing some conversations with families. There's a lot of follow through happening, and we're putting all these resources on our website. I don't know if I can necessarily share my screen, but I'm not going to mess with it. We got this beautiful flow chart that really kind of walks folks through. In most of these instances, we're collaborating. We're finding out what the barriers are, and we're working through that. We're coming up with an agreed upon plan. So we're doing a bit of that proportional SDI, saying this is what we can do directly, and this is how we're going to be collaborating with the teachers. And so that comes into kind of a summary page that says, and that's why we're calling it the COVID-19 distance learning plan. So we really want to contextualize it and make it abundantly clear that this is about how we're winging it during this closure. And as we move through the collaboration piece, it's that agreement, I think, protects us from parents coming back in September saying, gosh, we saw a lot of regression. Why didn't you serve those minutes? Then we can say, well, gosh, we connected with you. We had this great conversation. Here's the notes, and you agreed to it. Another logistical piece that we're working through is we really want to sink in that agreement piece. So we are bringing up we've designed some written agreements, both with we're looking at some of the guidance that we got from our SLP. LR. The Special Ed Connection Group. They've got some sample written agreements around evaluation and things like that. But the logistics that we're working on is to onboard everyone. We signed a contract with DocuSign. And so many of you have used that for your mortgage documents. And so we're onboarding our with doing that, so that way we can really churn through some written agreements and sending out these plans with parents. Other uses, our SLPs are looking at teleservices, and we want to make sure that we have a consent to conduct those teleservices. So having a mechanism that allows for an authenticated legal signature from the parent is something that we're moving to help unstick some of those logistical challenges. But at the heart of our work, I would say, is about family connection. And my priority as we're moving through this is that we seek out and identify the families that aren't making the connection, and that we lean in and really spend our effort and energy with finding out who they are and making personal phone calls, or even doing home visits. I just handed a couple of Chromebooks to a teacher where the family has a barrier with transportation. They've got internet, but they don't have a device or a car to get to, picking up the packets. And so I think that lens of equity is really helping us shape that. And I've got to brag, I've got the best special ed leadership team in the state, I believe. And I invited Suzanne, she's on the call. And Suzanne, is there anything you want to add, being our astute TOSA?
Thanks, Michael. I just wanted to say, if you guys could take a look at the flow chart, it's our team member, Josh Hewson, made it so that when you click on the spot on the flow chart, it goes directly to the form. And so people don't have to look for those forms. They can just go to the website page, go to the flow chart and click on it. And I think it's very user-friendly. So, yeah.
Thank you both very much for sharing and for being willing to share. Mary, can you go to the next slide? So with us today, I'm very grateful. We have Superintendent Corrine Barreras-Brown. I talked to you last night about being able to share where are you at with your community and your families. And you mentioned we're meeting them where they are. So can you unmute yourself and be willing to share with the group just a little bit of what you guys are doing and what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. I'd also like to say we have the best special ed leadership team ever. And I think I have a teacher on the line too today. I invited her to come along. I think that you know, when we say we're meeting students and families, and I would even say educators on where they're at when it comes to distance learning and our new reality, it's been, I think, challenging to say the least, but we have been very, very, I would say, I hate to use the word blessed, but I will say that for lack of a better term right now, to have a great crew of case managers and administrators and secretaries in our student services department to ensure that our kids that need us the most and our families that need us the most are that we're there for them, and that like Michael said about delivering things when we need to deliver them, or showing up when we need to show up, of course using the appropriate social distancing and safety gear as needed. But what we're lucky in Colton is that we've been investing over the last couple of years in technology. And so we have enough technology to provide one-to-one as needed for our students, and to even provide supports for our paraeducators to have teleworking equipment within their homes to be able to help support in small group instruction with either case managers or with classroom teachers. And we've also had a wonderful local telephone internet company, Colton Tel, that has allowed us to access services, internet service and Wi-Fi services for our families that don't have it. And so all we had to do was develop a letter that family would either bring in or send to the Colton Tel, and they would provide the actual Wi-Fi access. And for those who lived so far out that we couldn't provide that access because we're in a rural community, we worked with AT&T to help us provide hotspots to families so they could use their telephone service. And it has been, I think we've met everyone where they're at right now. I think everyone is hooked up to have a device during this time, as well as ensuring that we are doing a hybrid model, because we know that not all students, and if it was their accommodations, especially on their IEP or their 504 that they needed teacher notes or copies of certain things, that we're providing somewhat of a hybrid model that we would have packet work or tech access to our Google Classrooms with supports. And I think that we've had a lot of controversy going around, I would say, with superintendents and special ed directors around using Google Hangouts or video chat with students, and like, what's the FERPA requirement behind that, and how do we do this without, creating, well, how do we do it safely, I guess, let's put it that way. And so I basically have this lens in Colton with my educators that we're going to use the tools, because we live within a tech savvy generation. We have a lot of students that are probably more savvy with tech than some of our educators, and we have access to this technology, and that we've been practicing using these technologies within our classroom settings under specific supervisions, like you have Go Guardian or whatever on your Chromebooks, and you have Wi-Fi firewalls to protect things. And so now we're opening up that to a larger space, and with some of our students that are more vulnerable. So we just have developed our own protocol in what that looks like, and how families provide permissions, and that we know that some students might need support, particularly our students with special needs, and so that small group instruction is possible, just with making sure that we provide this specific safeguards, that we're not going to have any misconduct or be accused of any sort of misconduct. And then I think that making sure that we're communicating directly with families was really important for us. That anytime we were communicating with students, we were also communicating with families as we were rolling this work out, and specifically communicating with our families within our focal groups, like you had talked about in the beginning, because I feel like, you know, we talk about equity a lot in the state of Oregon, and when you're actually in the midst or you know, in the trenches doing the work, it's a whole different reality, right? Because you're actually living, working, breathing equity work. And when you're in a space where you could create even deeper digital divide or lack of, you know, I wouldn't say access, but we know that our students that are our focal groups, that they were far less likely, that they had a difficult time when we were right in front of them in the classrooms or engaging, or that they had a lot of, I don't want to say we set up a lot of barriers for our students and our families. And that now that we're not with them physically or in person, I think it creates even more of a disconnect for them. And culturally, this isn't any one of our cultures to communicate like this virtually, right? I'm talking and it's a blank screen because I don't have the Wi-Fi bandwidth in my home to have the video going at the same time when I'm talking. So I think that we know that this isn't culturally the way we communicate. So it even creates more of a stress on families that are working or trying to just are not working and trying to pay the bills. So there's a lot of impact on our focal families during this pandemic, even more so than we had before. And I think we need to be cognizant of that. And I'm just very lucky to have a group of educators and leaders in Colton and families that have been doing this work for quite some time. And what our motto is that we've just shifted. We've shifted from the brick and mortar school into a virtual reality, and that we are going to do our best and by ourselves and by our students. We're not going to, we don't like to go slow to go fast. We're not going to make these huge leaps and gains in a few weeks, but we plan on implementing the tools that have been provided by Oregon Department of Education. And we are planning every day as a student services department. And I think that connection piece that you spoke of in the beginning, Candace, about the number one priority should be that we're making connections with our families and that we're checking in on them and that we're providing the supports as needed for the mental health and for the academic. And that's what we're trying to do in Colton.
That was really beautiful, and we are very grateful to have you on here. I think the closer superintendents sit to this work and the more we're in deep partnership, the easier it is for everybody in the process. And so, thank you for modeling and leading the way. I will add the final one that I'm going to ask to speak when we think about this quote on here when we talk about hope. So Amy Joint in High Desert has agreed to share, like, what are you hopeful right now? We have a lot of fear and people have a lot of uncertainty, but there is hope can combat that, and hope can erode uncertainty, and hope can help us lean forward. Amy, are you willing to share High Desert, like your hope right now?
Absolutely. Well, I just have to say thank you for this webinar and this chance to have kind of a smaller group together. I think that was really wise and helpful. And I hear a lot of hope coming out of voices right now. I was just kind of sharing a story with a colleague via text messaging, like, 10 years ago or however many years ago as a school psychologist, I was always asked to test kids in special ed, get them out, get them out. Those are the kids in room 58. And that's no longer going to be the case, right? Like right now we are all in this together. And I think all of us on this line have experienced times when our students have been marginalized because of their disabilities. And that's just not an acceptable answer right now. And so I'm hopeful for that type of perspective. And I'm also hopeful to work with families in a different way. We always talk about, well, we only see them in the context of the schoolhouse, but now we have an opportunity to work with them holistically as a person. And so I am hopeful to look at our students who experience disability in a different way, and to support them in real interventions that are going to help generalize the skills that we've been trying to teach them in room 58. Thanks, Candace.
Thank you so much. So now, if people have questions about the toolkit or about supports or resources, feel free to open them. I will say there was a question about progress monitoring through this. We have not issued guidance on how to monitor progress, especially in light of the 3 buckets. I believe it could come in the form of that guidance document we talked about earlier, of tracking, identifying what does that look like, that could live within that. So that's still to come. So if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question. Or comments, or reach out.
Candace, I have a question, and this might be something that's still evolving. I understand that if we need to make changes to the IEP, we can use the form for now, but what about kind of the upcoming meetings? If we have an annual meeting that's scheduled for, or should be scheduled in mid-May, are we updating the IEP as if we're returning to regular school and writing it in that plan, with the idea the form and amendments that we're doing now are for the distance learning model? Kind of what do we do with those upcoming IEPs pieces? And then how do we do dates on those services too?
So it's a really good question. We don't have a solid answer yet because I think this is still evolving. As we listened to the governor yesterday in the compact on opening, there was not a clear indication of schools will open at this date. And so that is making us shift a little bit in when we would give guidance on, like, write your IEP for this date to open and this one. So I would say it's still evolving a bit. If you have an annual right now, I believe one of the areas you could do is to treat it as like you had it before. You're writing it for when students are in the schoolhouse. This is what this looks like, and we're going to use this in partnership with this. If not, you might be in the spot of having to amend it if you write it for distance learning for all, and then we come back. And so we'll work on some technical guidance on that, but that's a really good question to that we're going to be continually grappling with.
Great, thank you.
Candace, there's a question in the chat from Amy Tidwell, not specifically related, but what date should we use for the exit paperwork for seniors who are special education eligible, who now meet grad requirements?
So in the distance learning for all, the section, the toolkit section on seniors, there is guidance on there on the exit date. So it would be the same as whatever your registrar determines that they have met the criteria and exited. And so you'd want to work in conjunction with your the high school registrar on who's recording and putting that on the transcript, because that's the date you would capture for the summary of performance and for everything to live within that. The other big part in there to remember is that seniors who meet the traditional graduation requirements, so they have a cease of service now, right? Because there's a termination of service, and reminding parents of that, and then looking back through if they met that requirement and they're no longer going to have service, you know, what does that look like if the family's not ready for that? And so there's some options in that toolkit to consider for the school teams. Any other questions?
Candace, I don't know if it's necessarily a question, but just a thought that I'm struggling with, that I understand the whole distance for learning framework is built upon the UDL framework. And something is, I love that and believe in that, but it's also new for some of our staff, that sort of thinking, which is something we've been grappling with before any of this happened, is how do we create a gen ed environment that is supportive of all learners? And now we're asking them to not only shift to a distance learning model, but also rethink how they think about inclusion and differentiation and accommodations. And I think, unfortunately, and this was addressed, in somebody's comment earlier, middle school and high school in particular, it's a bigger challenge that we're facing. And so I don't have a distinct question, as more of a thought to throw out.
Yeah. And I would say that it's definitely highlighted and elevated. You know, after last week, we brought it to Colt and the executive leadership team that it needs to be part of the ongoing superintendent conversation and curriculum director conversation, that this is an approach that lived in the distance learning for all document that was generated from general education as a tenet of how can we reach the most students. And you're right, for so many districts, the thought of UDL is really far away from how they've ever approached. I would say there's a number of free resources on the CAS website to be able to start and think about, you know, what does this even look like? How can I plan this way? So what we've seen is some districts take this opportunity to be able to say, like, okay, I have this much time where I have teachers working, connecting, but also time that I want them to do some professional learning. I want you to dig in and spend some time doing some professional learning on this. Watch some videos on multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, right? That sounds scarier than it really is. Like there's some simple ways and tools to build kind of a framework for UDL. And I think it highlights what Christina mentioned earlier, that this pandemic and this situation that we are all living in highlights where the inequities already were and how far away you know, our students have been from general education sometimes, even though, you know, we may have them included, but the gen ed teacher maybe wasn't feeling the responsibility or the burden of the instruction for that learner. And so as this opportunity to just lean into and touch into and say, we got you. This is not a gotcha. This is not a you must tomorrow. This is a, hey, we've got this learner. Let me help you through this. Let me do a conversation with you, you know, for middle school math. How can we make this accessible in a way that this student can access it? If you planned for that, what would that look like? And what we're finding is that when we can, for any of our teachers, for special ed or gen ed, if we can, just like us, get out of the fear domain and out of that quadrant of being afraid and nervous and scared that they're going to do something wrong, and leaning into like, what could this look like and what are the possibilities? We're finding overwhelming. Our educators are gifted and they are smart and they are creative and they are leaning in with new and amazing ways that we could never prescribe for them in another way, in another setting. And so I hear you, I recognize that, I see you, and this is going to be a long journey through this process.
Candace, I'm getting people asking for copies of the slides. Are we going to make them available on the ODE site, or should we have them emailed to people who want them, or what's the plan?
They will be on the site, as well as this is a recorded webinar. And so
we've got another question, Candace. You mentioned that having a parent support SDI would be a part of the conversation with parents. We have some students who experience a level of impact that will necessitate that level of support. How would you recommend we move forward if parents are not willing or able to support?
Then I think you would go to those third options where you hold an IEP meeting. I would, if I had a student who had a complex situation, as well as a family that was impacted in a variety of ways. And so maybe they're unwilling to support because they are also working and they're trying to manage things, or they're unemployed and so they're seeking employment and food scarcity is an issue. And so whatever reasons are going on, I think it would be an important step if you're in that situation to hold an IEP meeting, to talk with the family and say, what can we do right now? What do you need right now? And if the family is really clearly in the like, I just need space away from you and the school and all of this, that is a great time to do a stand ready to serve letter. Keep connecting and reaching out and saying, we're here with you. So that doesn't mean that we're not providing all the resources and accesses and tools and a person to connect with, but we're going to respect that you're in a different space. And so I think that's, if I was in that situation, I would be working with that family in those, being able to say, let's bring together an IEP meeting and determine what can we do right now? What does that look like? Or, are we holding on this with a stand ready letter? So we will finish this up, and I will say, we left with a message of hope, because I want everybody to leave today feeling hopeful, to feel connected, to feel like you have resource and tools. We are responding to my, people mentioned they have the best team. I'm not sure that's possible, because I have the very best team. And so, we can all fight for that. My team at the department has been working around the clock, churning out guidance, issuing things. And at the same time, the moment you send a message, you send the flag that says, I need help, I need support, I need somebody to call me, we are there, and we're trying very hard to be very responsive to that. And so please know that we will continue to be throughout this. We want to be partners with you, and we want you to feel like you are not alone in this, and that we're with you, and we're in deep partnership in the service of our students. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful, wonderful Wednesday, tax day. Goodbye.